let's give it another 4 minutes, so 25. All right, let's get started. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I can hear.
Just checking every time these days. All right. Why don't we start with Sachin today and go up?
Yeah, interesting to read. I just started reading his other book, Art and Cosmotechnics, which is sort of applying the same cosmology idea to narratives and stories and art in general. But yeah, to respond to the prompt, yeah, I've been thinking about this, or sort of, I don't know if this counts as cosmology, but yeah, I guess I've been thinking about sort of how, like, what determines why some places have a certain kind of infrastructure versus some places don't. And for example, I think on the governance studies, we had a track on high-speed rail and trains. Venkat, can you mute?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we had a track on high-speed rail infrastructure in the governance studies chat, and I guess it is interesting to see sort of like the Western American specific efforts to build high-speed rail versus China, Japan, and all the Asian countries. And I think I sort of came to the conclusion that it has something to do with how those places are structured versus um, the West, which was kind of like a depressing conclusion. Because yeah, I guess like and it sort of applies to other modes of infrastructure also, um I was in Mexico City recently, and they have like dedicated bus lanes, and which is something that you see a lot in you see it in Mexico, then you see it a lot in like Latin American, like South American countries. Also, the high speed is the dedicated bus lane, and it makes sense because it's much cheaper, easy to build, and it's sort of like a muddling through solution to fix traffic in the short to medium term, which is what those places can manage to do because the sort of amount of political alliances and stuff required, I think, sort of, and the amount of money that they have sort of determines that in some way. And same with, I think, something about sort of like how the Chinese government is structured and incentivized both at this sort of state level and local levels. Sort of, there's just more a bigger chance of something like an expansive high-speed rail network happening versus in the US or Britain or anywhere else. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's just one of those things that people don't consider when making sort of grand plans like the California high-speed rail or things like that. And also reading this made me think it sort of feels like Conway's law, but applied to like city and regional scales, where the yeah, like what yeah, uh, yeah. I guess one more point place where I thought about this recently was yeah, I was reading about sort of like the Aztec history, and I did not know this, but apparently the Aztecs were Plains Indians who migrated from the southwest of the United States to Mexico City, and they reached Mexico City in 1400, and it took them 3 generations to migrate from somewhere in like Arizona, Wyoming, like around that area um, to Mexico City, and that's because they did not have the North America did not have horses at that point. At some point, North America had horses. It went extinct, and so like it's interesting to compare that to um, uh, like Mongols and to think like what would have happened if like North America had horses. How would that have affected the structure of that society, and what it would have looked like when they came in contact with Cortes and the Spanish. And um, anyway, I don't know how much of all that sort of applies to cosmology, but I'm trying to sort of feel my way around this topic. But I'll pass it up to Anuraj.
Yeah, so I read through the article once, but I couldn't grasp much about what the author is trying to say. But I kept thinking about somebody had asked recently asked on Twitter about like what would you change in the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire so that industrial revolution could happen faster and uh, would you if you dropped Francis Bacon in Roman Empire and told everyone this is the scientific method, would you get all the scientific revolution earlier? But I'm really not sure about that because I think like a lot of it also depends like the stories that are going around in societies about like uh, how everything works and the stories about societies tell about like uh, themselves, right? What the societies believe about themselves. So it also depends on a lot on that. So like I was not really sure like what would you really change so that a lot of so because like technological changes they were making technology but it was not as fast as like what you have in modern times. So yeah, that was something like I was thinking about. uh, yeah, that was those are some initial thoughts passing on to Anant.
Thank you. Yeah, I also try to read the article. I said try because I don't think I fully grasped what I was trying to get at. I used an LLM to sort of make it simple in some sense that if I can uh, at least have a sense for where is going. And my sort of sense is this idea of I suppose the core idea is this idea of cosmotechniques, which is uh, sort of like a um, is I guess like a idea of technology where you don't just sort of have technology in the sort of objective like rational sense or what he calls as like the Kantian view versus it's actually some sort of a fuse between the cosmology which I'm supposing is is notion of like including temporality into technology plus some sort of like a moral order of that particular cosmology built into that technique, which I think is this idea of cosmotechniques. And I guess the whole essay is like how that becomes politics, or at least that's my sort of reading of it, if I understand it correctly. Uh, my sense was it. I mean, where I found myself sort of thinking or sort of agreeing with this type of thinking is, yeah, like the technology is obviously like, I mean, I think it's the uh, nature of technology. I forget the author's name now. It talks about like how each new way of technology is built upon the previous news of technologies. Like technology by sort of definition is sort of like as some lineage or genealogy to it, which I kind of buy, which I think makes sense from an engineering perspective. But his idea of cosmotechnics also includes like a cultural angle, which I don't know if it's really moral order, or at least that's what I'm trying to understand from my reading and from my LLM summary. Uh, and the sort of cultural contingency on this technological development makes different alternatives both possible and sort of like almost like a, I guess is you would say it's like a moral imperative to explore. Uh, that seems like reasonable to me in the sense that yeah, there are different ways of interpretation and like different applications of different interpretations could lead to different outcomes in some sense. But uh, I somehow think that this whole idea of um, intermingling of what I think of like objective technology with this other soft layer and sort of thinking of the two as one combined entity seems uh, I don't know. That's what I lose, I guess, the thinking a little bit. And also, I think I heard a video of him talking about like a 10-minute summary of his idea and kind of refers to uh, basically his philosophical grounding, I suppose, is from the last 400, 500 years. And he kind of says that the European thinking in prior to 1500s was very isolated, and he kind of starts looking only from there, which I don't know if I buy that. I think there was a lot more going on. I mean, the recent Cosmopolis of Sale is like a good example of like uh, a lot more sort of cosmopolitanism going on in that time, and it wasn't quite as isolated as he says. Or maybe he doesn't, but this is just a YouTube video where I heard him say. But that's where I kind of lose uh, is thinking a little bit in the sense that uh, it calls about the when he talks about the homogenization of technology and calls about the Western thinking as the sort of the leading sort of force there, and he kind of proposes an alternative, but without like uh, fundamentally changing the form in some sense. Like it's like a different flavor of the same thing. That's kind of what I get uh, reading from this. Uh, yeah, so uh, I guess I said a lot of things. I don't know if that made sense, but I'm kind of uh, trying to think if maybe reacting to prompt is like a better way to explain like the idea of like Chinese and American infrastructure again like prefixes a certain cultural connotation to like a piece of thing that's in and of itself is not uh, does not have sort of any cultural or moral order baked into it. It's just a piece of engineering artifact. It reminded me also of like growing up when I first had to build my own computer and like with parts that I could procure from like random uh, 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 like random computer stores, like local computer stores in Chennai. I remember buying like a motherboard and like some Intel processors and like a bunch of these different components like DRAMs, hard disks, and whatnot. Some were American, some were not, and like when you put it all together, ultimately I had to run. I mean, I had to run like a bootleg version of like a Microsoft version on it. And like most of the software I downloaded and like sort of installed games and other stuff was using BitTorrents, and you had like servers all over the world, uh, uh, which is a whole separate sort of rabbit hole. But uh, basically, I don't know if it cleanly separates the sharp distinction of cosmotechnics is as clean as the article claims to be. Like in my sense, there's like many overlapping parts of uh, different genealogy, if you will, that I was using essentially to get access to internet and everything on the internet. But uh, anyway, that reacted to prompt reminded me of that. Uh, anyway, I'll stop now. I'll pass it to Venkat.
Hey, it's interesting listening to you guys because I think you guys are coming in pretty much cold to this whole area. And I think in one way or the other, I've been exposed to it for quite a long time now, but I properly got into it only about 6 months ago with ChatGPT help. Um, but yeah, this is a particular way of talking about technology that I think started with Heidegger's essay called The Question Concerning Technology, I think is the name of the essay. It's kind of a, I haven't read it except through like Wikipedia gloss and ChatGPT, but it seems to be honestly kind of stupid essay because Heidegger was a good political philosopher in many ways, even though he turned Nazi. But on technology, his intuitions were kind of stupid. But he had a couple of things about human relation to technology that were quite insightful. So if you take Heidegger very narrowly, you will get some good insights into technology. So basically, how the human identity and technology kind of blend together. And if you follow that course of thought, you'll get Byung-Chul Han, who several of us have read, and all of Byung-Chul Han's recent writings about technology kind of derive from Heidegger. So that's one strain. Another is this philosopher named Gilbert Simondon, who's also, I think, a little later than Heidegger, but he wrote an essay called On the Mode of Existence of Technological Objects, which was very influential. So something about like in what sense do technological objects exist and how is that existence different from, say, art objects or other natural objects or something. So it started some of this conversation. And there's a guy who died recently, Bernard Stiegler, who came one generation later. So he picked up these questions. And Yuk Hui, I think, is a student of Stiegler. So that's kind of the genealogy of this idea space. But all of them basically work within the continental philosophy tradition and have a particular language they use about this. So it's related to critical theory, but not quite. It's pretty abstract. They came up with all this language like cosmotechnics and cosmopolitics. Another name to keep in mind is a guy named Mark Fisher. These two the last two I met in person. So at some event, I was actually on a panel with Mark Fisher, and another one I was speaking, and Bernard Stiegler was the keynote speaker. So I kind of like saw this culture up close and personal, and they're definitely a very political and weird academic community, of course, left leaning, as you can tell from the way they talk. But yeah, it's a very particular tradition, and if you don't understand where they're coming from, this will sound like gobbledygook to you. But if you understand where they're coming from, and yeah, ChatGPT is a pretty good way to get up to speed, you can kind of like factor that out and like actually pull out the things they're saying that's interesting and not just their own weird jargon. But yeah, I think Anand's instincts are right. They think the distinction is much cleaner than it is. And I think yeah, your example of like building a computer with parts and bits and pieces from all over and it still works shed some interesting light on how they think, because a modern computer, even if it comes from like a very global supply chain coming from very different technological cultures, it's still architecturally a device that comes from the European tradition. That's why it hangs together. I think a better example of like or illustration of cosmotechnics in the sense I think Yuk Hui wants to construct it is something like, WeChat or TikTok. So these you can say are expressions of very Chinese ways of thinking about and using technology. And we've talked about some of this stuff in the governance chat. Another one was Pinduoduo, the social shopping app that I think was inspired by Chinese night market type culture. So that's kind of the example. Like if you had a bunch of technological capabilities and you had like a fairly big design space and you could architect a solution to a problem in multiple different ways, how would you actually do that? Would you make a phone app that looks like a night market? Would you make a website that looks like a shopping mall in the US? Would you make it look like a European supermarket? So all those choices, I think, kind of get at cosmotechnics, but it's slightly unsatisfying because at that level, it looks like you're just doing something similar to artistic expression. And here I was trying to think of an example. Like if you look at digital art in the 80s when resolution was very low and everything was 8-bit art, you could say 8-bit art was a particular type of art, right? The technology itself was so tightly constraining that 8-bit artwork had a very particular look. It wasn't like, European art or Chinese art. It was 8-bit art. The medium defined the art itself very strongly. But now we have like retina level resolution, and resolution is no longer a constraint. So basically any artistic style you want, you can express. If you want to like create a painting in Chinese ink brush style, you can do that. If you want to do an impressionist style painting, you can do that. So the resolution is no longer the constraint. So as the technology has improved, it has loosened the constraint of the design space and then allows for arbitrary cultural expression. So this, I think, if that's what Yukui is talking about, that's not interesting because at that level, technology has basically been factored out of the variety. So yes, there's diversity and pluralism, but it's not relevant technically. So the question becomes, when there are strong constraints, but there is still some design freedom, do you solve the trade-offs in different ways depending on where you're from? And I think here, Sachin's comment that this looks like Conway's law at the level of civilizations and cultures makes a lot of sense, right? So if you're not familiar with that, that's the idea that org structure mimics product structure. And if there's a organization with 4 teams building a compiler, they will build a 4-pass compiler. So it's that type of mirroring idea. I think there's something interesting there, but I'm still struggling to think of a good example. Like one example that's not reducible to either cultural expression or just scarcity in the 8-bit sense might be Japanese products, right? Like the reason I don't like WeChat and Pinduoduo type things is they're actually expressions of scarcity in a different way. It's like the 8-bit problem. Like China is a poorer country than the West, so most people, the only computer they have access to is a smartphone, a cheap smartphone, which means everything has to work through phone apps. That's why that everything app architecture emerged. If they were rich enough that everybody had laptops, they would have come up with a more Western style thing, I think. So there, it's apps are like not an expression of Chinese technological styles so much as the fact that Chinese are poor. But Japan is kind of interesting, I think, because in the beginning, yes, it was poor, but once it caught up and became as rich as the West, it still developed a technological culture that was quite different. They did robots differently. They did computers differently. They did many things differently. So, but I haven't been to Japan. Sachin has. Maybe he has some comments. But I think Japanese technologies may be an example of, a uniquely different cosmotechnic. So that may be evidence for Yukui's thesis that there's basically more than one way to do technology. That's like if you throw away all the, in some ways, unnecessary jargons of like weirdly spelled techniques and things like that. Mainly what he's saying is that technology is not one thing with a single history and future. It's diverse in a very essential and deep way that's not just based on culture and scarcity. It fundamentally is more diverse. So he's making an argument, I think, similar to biology. Like, there are many different species that are specialized in many different ways and solve the same problem in different ways. Sometimes it's convergent evolution, but other times it's not. So he's making that type of plurality argument with technology. And I think, I would say, I'm not convinced yet, but I'm not convinced. So maybe 50-50. Like it could go either way. Like maybe it's true that all technology is a single thing. I don't know. The other thought I had was, Anuraj's comment on the Roman Empire thing was kind of interesting, and it relates to that part in the article where he comments that Kant at that 1795 point didn't have the data to talk about pluralism, which is not true because 1795 Europe was already heavily exposed to Arabian science and technology. So he did have the data to think about, maybe technology is pluralist rather than, single origin story. And the way it relates to Anuraj's thought experiment is, I think even asking the question, what could you have done to trigger the Industrial Revolution in Rome, presupposes that technology is a single-threaded story that starts in ancient Greece and ends in modern Europe and America, which is, of course, a story that the West would like to be true. But I think the reality is, if you pick any point in time, I think you'll find a lot of threads converging into it and a lot of threads diverging out of it. So yeah, modernity was not a direct descendant of just Greece and Rome. It also had threads coming from Arabia in like one step in the graph, right? So papermaking, gunpowder, early aerospace, some stuff that came from Europe but went through the Arabs, but also other stuff that came from China and India. So that convergence point where modernity began was multiple inheritance basically, and then it diverged again. So I think Yukui missed that particular point. So my answer to Anuraj's thought experiment would be the question is wrong. It's because Rome was not a single origin, single inheritance point from which the Industrial Revolution came. The Industrial Revolution had multiple parents. So that's one way to think of it. Anyway, so those are some thoughts. And to my own prompt, yeah, digital culture, especially this gang of philosophers, I think has some useful things to say. Uh, but I think they're missing too many important things, and this is part of the stuff I was getting at in the talk I did last week. I like some of the terminology. I like the idea of you know calling it cosmotechnics and relating it to cosmopolitanism at a cultural level. So there's some interesting and philosophical strategies that I'm interested in borrowing from this group of philosophers. But overall, I think they don't understand technology and engineering well enough to truly make sense of it. They're fundamentally, I don't know, a bunch of left leaning political philosophers who dislike technology partly. That's the sense I get from it. Though Yukui is not as bad as the rest. Yukui, I think, likes technology. Anyway, floor is open for more comments.
But like there is some convergence in the way like societies are organized, right? So there is like a free market, stock market, raising capital, technological evolution, like how you raise capital to evolve or make technology. So some of it is universal, although they might have like flavors of it, but like a lot of it is basically like kind of converging to a common point, right?
I don't know that many people would agree with that right now because a huge number of people think China represents a different model. So it's like state sponsored markets as opposed to like free market capitalism. So that particular example you used as universal convergence, I think people would argue. But yeah, there may be other points where, uh, like I think used to be a stronger contender is separation of state and religion, which allowed natural philosophy to become different from religious philosophy, and then science and technology descended from natural philosophy. That might be a universal because I think religion, when it gets entangled with secular thinking, it basically kills it. So that might be an example of a universal that works. But market economy, I think people would now argue there's at least two solutions to the problem, Chinese and American. And what's in the book Art and Cosmotechnics? You're reading that, Sachin?
Yeah, I only so the he's sort of talking about how the storytelling tradition, like at the beginning at least, he's talking about how storytelling traditions differ in Asia versus the West, and it's specific to he's talking about the form of tragedy, and he
Oh,
says basically in the West, tragedy is sort of like a moral battle between two people, or like some sort of moral battle, and in the Asian tradition, it's more of a cosmic tragedy, like sort of people being helpless to the indifference of nature, or something like that. Yeah. I was wondering if for um, yeah, like the cosmology sort of this cosmotechnics thing applies to digital culture to a certain extent, um, and I wonder if like sort of big sort of engineering or more complex infrastructure is like a good place to sort of compare um, and see if there is something to cosmotechnics. Like I was thinking about like Boeing versus Airbus uh, in terms like as like um, like do some specific technologies prefer a specific social structure versus the other. Um, like Boeing is more free market versus Airbus is more state supported in some way, and that is that just works better. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that one's interesting. And I think to that example set, you can add the Chinese civilian airliner, which is still struggling. I think they've solved all problems, but they haven't been able to replicate the Western jet engine technology. And India tried but gave up. Um, Brazil managed to start a small airliner industry, but they still can't make engines, as far as I know. Engines are the hard part. But yeah, Airbus versus Boeing could be an example of cosmotechnics because in Europe, no single country has the critical mass to build something as complex as a airliner, but the US does. Uh, Soviet Union did too, but it was kind of crappy quality. China has the critical mass to do it too, but they haven't yet gotten there.
I think like if push comes to shove, like France could do it. So because a lot of the basic core technology of Airbus, I think, happens in France. So and they want to keep it there, and they build their own fighter jets, right?
Yeah, and they have Safran, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Safran is the engine company from France. So
So
yeah, I
they,
think they're the only
yeah.
ones.
Right now they don't do it, maybe for like economic reasons, but like if forced to do it, they could build their own thing.
Yeah. Another good example would be aircraft carriers, especially nuclear powered aircraft carriers. As far as I know, the US is the only country that has managed to pull that off. But I think China will get that nuclear aircraft carriers.
Just one
Yeah,
comment about
space
this.
programs.
No, go
Sorry,
on.
go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about this
I was
art and cosmotechnics book. It like supposes that like technology is different from art, but for me, like I have seen lots of people do like artistic things. For example, people have run Linux on 8-bit computers, which is kind of an art and totally useless, but it's like an art for me. And like that, you could have like lots. So yesterday, I ran like a Bitcoin miner on a microcontroller. It's totally useless, but it's kind of an art. So yeah, that was just something I thought about.
Yeah, I was gonna say space program seem to differ. Like the Indian space program is always like seen as doing bigger things for much cheaper. Uh, yeah, I don't know. There's different countries and their space programs may also be a interesting place.
The example of Airbus and Boeing reminded me of. I was thinking about F1 and NASCAR as like another two examples of cosmo techniques in some sense, like celebration of motorsports in like different ways, like American versus maybe European or continental way in some sense.
That actually connects interestingly to Anuraj's comment about art. So when you've kind of solved all the interesting practical problems that are worth solving with the technology, and you still have like surplus capacity, you start doing more artistic things. So F1 versus NASCAR and the different engineering trade-offs they make, they're essentially artistic, but they're not superficially cultural. They're artistic, but in a way that impacts how you do technology. So maybe, yeah, I think there's something there. It could be that cosmotechnical diversity and variety starts showing up when you have enough surplus technological potential that you can start doing art instead of only solving, necessary problems. Like a hypothetical example, like green revolution and other technology to produce high yielding crop varieties. If you get to a point of like complete abundance and you can grow anything you want, maybe people start breeding really weird types of crops. And you already see some of that, like people breeding crops with special properties, but so far they're still kind of practical, like, low fat or high protein or things that are interesting. But you could imagine people making up, I don't know, red colored rice just because people want the color. So that might be cosmotechnics as well. Anyway, we are at the hour, so yeah. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.